Welcome to this review of the preseen information. Remember why the preseen information exists, and its primary role is to make sure you're familiar with the industry and to make sure any terminologies that are mentioned, if you're not clear on, you become clear on. So let's have a look. We've got here the contents, and we see that it's based on a company called Mercer Company, which is a publisher which publishes both magazines and digital format stuff. So that's the industry which it's in. As I'm reading through it, what do I see? Well, the first thing I see that as well as doing magazines, they also provide some market research services. So to me, I would just be making sure that data protection, and I understand about data protection and the consequences of not doing it correctly, would be my first thing I saw reading through it. It then goes on a little bit lower down that the market for printed magazines is diminishing. This is backed up by later graphics which show the volumes going down. But even though it is diminishing, it's going to stay, significant for some time to come. So, but just be aware, it is a declining market. What do we then have? Well, this is all about the sector in general, and the sector in general produces magazines and media for all kinds of leisure activities and interests, from sports to celebrities, just like in real life, really. So some of those areas are likely to be more profitable than others. If you were running a business of this nature, you would probably be using portfolio analysis to decide where you invest and where you divest. So probably if you are not familiar, have a little look at portfolio analysis using maybe things like the Boston Consulting Group Matrix, the BCG Matrix, where they talk about cash cows and dogs, and maybe the product life cycle. I think just remind yourself, because that would be a useful framework to help you prioritize investments and divestments. Yep. What else do we have? Well, there's not consistency across the sector with regards to digital content. Some magazines have extensive, others don't. But where you do have digital content, remember that the opportunity for data mining is much greater, because I would know when someone clicks on a magazine how long they read that article for. The person would have to log on, so I know the demographics of that person. Lots of information can be gained from people accessing digital content, whereas when someone buys a magazine at a newsstand, we don't know which articles they read, we don't know how long they read it for, we don't even know who that person is, we just know we made a sale. So appreciate the opportunities that digital content provides. So continuing about the sector, over on page 3 here we have information with regards to the various staff of the magazine and what they do. Yep, so just be appreciative of those roles. Some are directly involved in the content, others are there supporting it. But yeah, just have digest that. Also, it talks here about authors, and it talks about once an article has been written by an author, it's reviewed by editors. Yeah. So I just wonder, what is the system there of review? How do they avoid the editor making a mistake? Is there anything in place, for example, with regards to plagiarism or with regards to incorrect content? Can we authenticate the content to be, verified and true? In the mock I wrote, I did actually put a question in I'll record another thing about the kind of questions I did on my mock, but yeah, that could be something that could come up, and something you should familiarize yourself with regards to, if there was a mistake, if you write something that's incorrect, there could be legal consequences. There could be all kinds of consequences. I'll talk about that in another webinar. He talks about the software, and what happens here is publishers pay an external person often, and I would be concerned about the security of these external persons' sites. If there's a data breach, maybe they would be liable, but the impact is most likely to be on the magazine. They're the ones whose reputation is going to be damaged. So we need to make sure that these external suppliers of software have very secure systems so that there's no data leakage. We also are just highlighted to the fact that we can do data analytics, as I just said previously. We can integrate it with e-marketing. That makes me think, well, I better just make sure my knowledge of big data and the benefits and the drawbacks of big data are all polished and ready in case questions go in that direction. It then summarizes where income comes from, fairly straightforward, either selling a magazine, subscribing to a magazine, or to the digital platforms, and also the money made from advertising. Now, in terms of expenses, it talks about paper. What do we need to make sure we're familiar with on paper? Well, they do mention about their social responsibility, and we need to make sure that the paper used is environmentally sound. It's from a sustainable source, it's recycled, something along those lines. In the same way, it talks about the fact that some printers print themselves and others outsource the printing. So I think you need to make sure that you are fully aware of why people would outsource. Often outsourcing could be cheaper because the outsourcing provider could have economies of scale, but also we lose control, we become reliant. So again, in my mock, I did bring a question in where we talked about the pros and cons of outsourcing. So just make sure that you are fully familiar with the pros and cons of outsourcing, so that if a question did come in that area, you are ready for it. It then talks about distribution, and it talks about how, they have distribution centers, they're transported from the printing location. It just, if you are going to be socially and environmentally responsible here, what kind of transportation is being used? Are they using electric vehicles? Are they minimizing their environmental footprint when they're doing this? So just, have a little think about that as well. Over on page 5, it talks about stakeholders. One of them would be the industry body, which would be the Newspaper and Magazine Standards Authority. I just wonder, how much power do they actually have? Are they a really powerful stakeholder? In the UK, we have press regulators. It's only recently with phone hacking and stuff that maybe their powers have been upgraded, I'd say. But we've got a whole list of stakeholders here: the readers, the directors, the authors, the employees, the paper, the printers, all of them. Think about each of these stakeholders. Think about what kind of power do they have, and what are they interested in. And, we should from that be able to work out who are the most relevant and who the stakeholders we need to look after, and which stakeholders maybe we don't have to worry about too much. Also think about how we communicate with our stakeholders. So again, in the mock I wrote for my students, I wrote a question which basically talked about how would you communicate to these stakeholders, and you should be familiar that the way in which we communicate to stakeholders, or one of the best ways to communicate with them, is using something like integrated reporting. So if make sure you brush up on your knowledge of integrated reporting. You don't necessarily have to talk about the 6 capitals, but the 6 capitals is a great framework that provides you with a structure to develop an answer in terms of integrated reporting. So have a look at that. It also talks about the challenges, and basically, the income is falling for the printed stuff. And it mentions here at the bottom that the industry is in a state of continuous consolidation, with takeovers or buyouts of publishers. So as maybe volumes fall, what needs to happen is our cost base would go up, because the cost per unit will increase because we've got less subscribers. So in order to make sure our cost per units remain competitive, we might have to buy another magazine company. So you need to make sure you're aware of the drawbacks and the benefits of consolidation. When we buy another company, should we buy it? Shouldn't we? Think about, is it suitable? Is it feasible? Is it acceptable? If you go onto the ACCA website, there's an article I've written on the strategic planning process. Take a look at that. It talks about suitability, feasibility, acceptability. So yeah, just be aware of that. Also, in terms of risks, there's a kind of whole risk register here. So for each of these risks, I would think about them. I would think about how might you measure them? How might you mitigate them? Just so if a question comes up in the area of risk, and such questions do regularly come up on SPL, you're in a good place to be able to discuss and develop a good answer there. So just have a think how we would mitigate legal, cybersecurity, and so on. Okay. It then talks about key performance indicators in the sector. So just make sure you understand why these performance indicators are used, what benefits do we have from them, and then after that, going through the sector, what we have here is going or looking through the actual company of Mercer. Yep, and a lot of what Mercer does reflects what the industry does, and again it mentions that they've got 300 different magazine titles. They've most of them are monthly, some of them are weekly or quarterly, and they both have print and digital platforms. So again, if we got an extra exhibit in the exam and we were asked to evaluate what was going on, I think we should be familiar with portfolio analysis. So, just reminding you, make sure you understand BCG, make sure you understand product life cycle. It talks specifically about the values. Before it does do that, it also talks about it's listed on the stock exchange. So remember, if you're listed on the stock exchange, the owners and the managers are not the same, and therefore corporate governance is relevant. There is an agency problem that the employees are agents of the owners, the shareholders. To protect the owners, we follow good corporate governance. Yep. So just make sure your knowledge of corporate governance is all up to speed. In terms of specifics of Mercer, it talks about its mission, its values, and what they stand for. The reason it's important to really digest and remember this is what potentially could happen would be Mercer looks at buying another company. The other company it's going to buy does not maybe share the values which Mercer have, and you'd be asked to maybe assess the appropriateness of that acquisition and how you would develop an argument there with regards to suitability, feasibility, and acceptability would be the strategic fit maybe between their behaviours. Yep. So as we have already been highlighted, the ownership, it's a floated company, and it talks about the shareholder mix here. It talks about they've got a 50-50 split of NEDs and executives, which, yeah, that's what the corporate governance says. So we do have a balanced board. Interestingly, what's happening in corporate governance in many companies now is we often just have a CEO and a CFO, and then everyone else is a NED. Yeah. But appreciate the value of NEDs, appreciate what they do, appreciate the nomination, audit, remuneration, and risk committee, and what do they do, and why do we have NEDs? We have NEDs because they're experts. They're able to challenge the executive board on behalf of the shareholders. Yep. There's then something about the organisation of Mercer, about its different divisions. I just thought it was a fairly. There was lots of offices, and there was there's potential for duplication there, and I just think they might want to rationalise some of that. It talks about working from home. My issues with working from home is the security of systems when working from home. In COVID, a lot of people were just kind of sent home, and they weren't sent home on encrypted laptops, and there was a lot of hacking into companies during COVID because of insecure laptops. So when you're working from home, you've probably on a proper secure laptop, you'll have proper access to prevent people hacking and then getting involved in kind of cyber crimes and all that kind of stuff. So, fairly topical. So just how secure is it? It then goes on the specifics of Mercer and its paper and printing. It states publicly they obtain materials from sustainable resources. Okay, but have they audited that? Have they got environmental credentials that are independently verified, or do they just say, "Oh, we've got sustainable paper"? Mercer does its printing in-house. As I said before, outsourcing, the pros and cons of outsourcing, make sure you are familiar with them and make sure you can talk about them in the context of Mercer here. There's arguments both ways, but you maybe have a bit more flexibility with outsourcing, but also you do become maybe a bit reliant on that outsourcer. Make sure you appreciate that. And again, the distribution, how green is that distribution going on? And do they try their best to make sure that that they are environmentally friendly? Appreciate even things like EMAS, which is a standard which would kind of tell people that this company has obviously been audited, and it's a green thing because of the EMAS credentials. We then have some information over on page 9 about IT systems, and in this stuff here, I'm just it says they've used this publishing company for a while. It's an external company. It's managed in line with data protection regulations, but I think because of the consequence of a data breach being so big, I'd like to have some kind of external independent verification that everything they do is appropriate. Yep. So you should be thinking about data breaches. You should think about how you protect against data breaches. You should think about the consequence of data breaches and, what could happen. We then have a corporate social responsibility statement, again, similar to the mission and values. Be familiar with all of these things. They say they want trustworthy and original content. Well, how do they ensure that it is trustworthy and original? Do they have a system in place for verification? Yep, is there potential for fake news? It then talks about how they treat their employees well, how they, want to have good dialogue with stakeholders, and it talks about their social and environmental commitment. Yep, we should be familiar with all of that because, as I said before, there's a likelihood, as the industry is full of consolidation constantly, that they might be buying another company and or merging with another company. So is it suitable, feasible, acceptable? Read the article I've written on strategic planning process part 2. I think it is on the ACCA website. That will help you in a situation. And what you would be looking at is, do those values that are mentioned here, do they link with the values of a company they're thinking about acquiring? They probably won't. So there's going to be change management issues, so make sure you're up to speed on change management. Again, in my mock, I did do something on change management. So make sure you're familiar with why people are resistant to change, how we change. So on-freeze, change, refreeze, contextual factors of change. Take a look at that. Okay, and then we have some information right at the end on financial stuff. The revenue has been growing, but revenue from publications, as we can see here, has been falling, but it's still 350 million, so it is still quite significant. Operating profit has dropped a bit. Why has it dropped? Maybe higher costs. Advertising revenue's gone up, but print-based volume's gone down. It talks about energy here, but this graph starts at 1300 and ends at 1400, and it's not as severe. Imagine it was 0, you would hardly notice that movement. But it might be just because there's a decline in printing, or maybe you've got more efficient machines, who knows. That's the preseen. Remember, the preseen is there to help you familiarize yourself with the industry, familiarize yourself with any terminologies, but also hopefully I've helped you there to be alert to areas which lend themselves to questions in certain areas. I'm not trying to question Spot, but for someone who's been involved with this for 25 years, they are the bells that are ringing in my head. And I'll also share with you what I talked about on my mock day. Students, I wrote a mock. I also wrote extra questions for them to consider. So I'll do that in another webinar. It'll be on my YouTube channel, and hopefully that helps, and I wish you all the very best in your exam.